Step into the bullet-riddled backstreets of 1930 Chicago, where one gangster's rage left a trail of chaos that even hardened criminals feared. Babyface Nelson, small in stature but deadly in reputation, wasn't just another outlaw. He was the most violent bank robber of his era. From his explosive robberies and cold-blooded shootouts to his final, brutal stand against the FBI, this is the untold story of the madman the Bureau called Public Enemy Number 1. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell icon, as well as leave a like and a comment for more videos each week. Before we begin this journey into the dark heart of the Great Depression's criminal underworld, I must offer a crucial disclaimer. The story you are about to hear is a historical account, pieced together from FBI case files, contemporary news reports, court transcripts, and biographies. Its purpose is not to glorify crime, but to present to you, the viewer, the unvarnished facts of a life that spiraled into infamy. Our sole aim is to deliver correct information in an engaging narrative form. So, settle in, and let's step back in time. And if you appreciate deep dives into forgotten histories, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us bring these meticulously researched stories to light. Now, picture Chicago in the early 1930s. The air is thick with the smoke of industry and despair. Prohibition has spawned empires of bootleg alcohol, and the police are often outgunned, outmaneuvered, or simply on the payroll. In this world, legends are made overnight. But one name struck a different kind of fear, a name that evoked not grudging respect but pure, unadulterated terror: Babyface Nelson. His real name was Lester Joseph Gillis, a boy from the rough-and-tumble streets of Chicago's near North Side. But the name Babyface was a cruel joke, a taunting label hung on him by the press that completely belied the monster within. He stood just 5 feet 4 inches, with a youthful, almost choir-boy countenance, featuring rounded cheeks and wide, intense eyes. Yet, behind that boyish facade simmered a bottomless well of rage, an insatiable hunger for violence, and a pathological hatred for authority that would make him the most volatile and vicious criminal of the Public Enemy era. While Dillinger charmed the public and Pretty Boy Floyd was mythologized as a Robin Hood, Nelson possessed no redeeming charm. His currency was pure, unbridled fury. His story is not one of cunning heists or charismatic escapes, but a raw, accelerating plunge into bloodshed. His rise was not a climb but an explosion, ignited from the very beginning. Young Lester was a street brawler, a delinquent whose first arrest came at the age of 13 for stealing a car. Reform school only honed his resentments and connected him with a better class of criminal. By his late teens, he had graduated to armed robbery, holding up local stores and businesses with a reckless bravado that was more menace than method. It was here the pattern was set. Where other robbers might use a gun as a threat, Nelson used it as an immediate tool of punishment. A hesitated cashier, a slow-moving security guard, any perceived slight could trigger a beating or a shot. This wasn't strategic crime. It was emotional catharsis. He married young, to a woman named Helen Warzenack, who would become not just a loyal spouse but an active accomplice, driving getaway cars and harboring him with a ferocity that matched his own. By the time the stock market crashed in 1929, plunging America into the Depression, Lester Gillis had fully shed his skin. He was now George Nelson in the underworld, a name he preferred, though the babyface moniker clung to him like a ghost he could never exorcise. His reputation as a loose cannon kept him from the upper echelons of organized crime. The Capones and the Nitties wanted businessmen, not psychopaths, so he operated with smaller, equally violent crews. He drifted into the orbit of John Dillinger's gang in 1934, not as a subordinate, but as a terrifying force of nature they felt compelled to harness. Dillinger, recently escaped from Crown Point Jail with his famous wooden gun, was America's most wanted, but he was a planner, a showman. Nelson was pure, unpredictable destructiveness. Their union would prove catastrophic, marking the beginning of the end for the great gangster era. Nelson brought with him 2 men who matched his violent temperament: John Paul Chase, a hulking, devoted killer, and Tommy Carroll. Together, they formed the lethal sharp end of the Dillinger spear. But Nelson chafed under any suggestion of leadership. He was obsessed with proving himself, with outdoing Dillinger in sheer audacity and body count. His bank robberies were not surgical strikes, they were traumatic events. He would leap over counters screaming, firing bullets into ceilings and floors to induce panic. He pistol-whipped tellers for moving too slowly. He took perverse pleasure in humiliating police officers caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The money was almost secondary. The primary objective seemed to be the unleashing of his own internal hurricane upon the world. This is where his legend truly began to fester, not in the vaults of banks, but on the open road, in what would become his signature theater of war, the violent, spontaneous ambush of law enforcement. For Nelson, a police car in the rearview mirror wasn't a signal to hide. It was an invitation to a duel. This relentless, aggressive hatred for the G-men and local police set him apart from every other fugitive of his time, making him not just a criminal to be captured, but a rabid animal to be put down. The pace of his violence escalated with dizzying speed after he joined Dillinger. The gang holed up at the Little Bohemia Lodge in Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin, in April 1934, seeking rest. The FBI, under the direct command of J. Edgar Hoover, had been tipped off. What followed was a fiasco for the Bureau, but a showcase of Nelson's chilling brutality. As FBI agents quietly surrounded the lodge in the dead of night, their approach was betrayed by the barking of dogs. Gunfire erupted. In the chaotic darkness, Nelson, Helen, and John Paul Chase managed to slip away from the main lodge to a nearby cottage. At dawn, they commandeered a car from an unsuspecting civilian. This is where the story crystallizes into the essence of Babyface Nelson. They hadn't driven far when they were spotted by FBI Special Agents W. Carter Baum, Herman Hollis, and a local officer. Instead of fleeing, Nelson ordered Chase to stop the car. What happened next was not a shootout, it was an execution. Nelson and Chase leaped from their vehicle, firing submachine guns and rifles with methodical frenzy. Special Agent Baum, shot in the head, died instantly. Hollis was mortally wounded. The local officer, shot through the arm, played dead and survived. Nelson then walked calmly to the dying Agent Hollis, looked down, and fired a final, point-blank shot into his body. He then reportedly rummaged through the agent's pockets, stealing their weapons and badges as trophies. This act, the cold-blooded murder of federal agents, catapulted him to the very top of the FBI's list. John Dillinger was public enemy number one, but in the eyes of Hoover and his agents, Nelson was something worse, an unreasoning, unstoppable killer who welcomed confrontation. The Little Bohemia raid ended with Dillinger escaping, but the world now understood the new, terrifying dynamic. The gangster who craved the spotlight was now shadowed by a homicidal imp who thrived in chaos. The Bureau's humiliation was complete, and their vow of vengeance became personal, focused with white-hot intensity on the baby-faced killer who showed no fear and offered no quarter. His downfall was now inevitable, but the path there would be paved with even more bullets and blood, a final, furious sprint toward a violent end that seemed, in retrospect, to be the only conclusion possible for a man who lived his entire life at the trigger's edge. The aftermath of the Little Bohemia shootings transformed Lester Gillis from a notorious gangster into the FBI's white whale. J. Edgar Hoover, stung by the very public failure that saw Dillinger escape and two of his agents slaughtered, redirected the massive resources of the Bureau toward one primary objective: the eradication of Babyface Nelson. A nationwide manhunt of unprecedented scale was launched, but hunting Nelson was unlike tracking any other fugitive. Dillinger sought refuge in crowds and safe houses. Floyd hid in the rural hollows of Oklahoma. Nelson, however, seemed to be perpetually in motion, a shark who would die if he stopped. He, Helen, and John Paul Chase embarked on a desperate, violent trek from Wisconsin back to Chicago, a journey that was less a flight from justice and more a rolling crime spree. They needed money, cars, and hideouts, and Nelson's method of acquisition was consistently brutal. They hijacked vehicles at gunpoint, tying up and terrorizing their owners. They robbed smaller banks and grocery stores not for grand scores, but for traveling cash, each robbery punctuated by Nelson's trademark overkill: shattered glass, terrified civilians, and unnecessary volleys of gunfire that served no purpose but to vent his spiraling paranoia. This period showcased Nelson's operational reality. He wasn't a mastermind planning a peaceful retirement. He was a force of chaos trying to outrun his own impending explosion. The FBI's net was tightening, but Nelson's response was to become more aggressively visible, not less. He seemed to believe his own myth of invincibility, a dangerous delusion fed by every successful escape. He dyed his hair and grew a mustache, a feeble disguise that did little to conceal the fierce, recognizable intensity in his eyes. The pressure was turning him feral. He trusted no one outside his immediate triad, seeing G-men in every passing motorist, betrayal in every glance. This paranoia forged his final, fatal partnership. After Dillinger was gunned down outside the Biograph Theatre in July 1934, the mantle of public enemy number one was officially, and fittingly, passed to Nelson. The last remaining major threat was the quiet, bank-robbing mechanic from Missouri, Alvin "Creepy" Karpis. But Karpis operated with stealth. Nelson operated with a sledgehammer. Needing funds and feeling the walls closing in, Nelson made contact with another infamous duo, Homer Van Meter and Eddie Green. Yet, true to form, this collaboration ended in blood. In August, during a botched robbery in South Bend, Indiana, Eddie Green was shot by police and later died. Nelson saw it not as a tragic loss but as a personal insult. His world was shrinking, his options evaporating, but his capacity for violence was expanding exponentially. He was a cornered rat, and he possessed a machine gun. The inevitable, fatal collision course was set for November 1934. The location would be the unassuming, sleepy suburb of Barrington, Illinois, a landscape of rolling fields and quiet roads, about 30 miles northwest of Chicago. On November 27th, a crisp Wednesday afternoon, Nelson was riding in a stolen 1934 Ford the 5.8 with Helen and John Paul Chase. They were reportedly on their way to meet a contact to arrange a new hideout. Nelson, uncharacteristically, was in the passenger seat, with Chase driving. Helen was in the back. At the same time, two of the FBI's most determined agents were patrolling the area. Samuel P. Cowley, a devout Mormon and dedicated agent handpicked by Hoover to coordinate the Dillinger and Nelson cases, was in charge. With him was Inspector Herman Hollis's former partner, the veteran agent Edward J. Holohan. They were in a sleek, powerful 1934 Chevrolet sedan, a car meant for speed. By pure, tragic chance, the two cars passed each other on what is now Route 14, near the intersection of Hill Road. Recognition was instant and electric. Nelson, peering out the window, locked eyes with the federal agents. Cowley, a sharp investigator, likely noted the matching description of the stolen Ford. In a split-second decision, both cars swung into violent U-turns. This was the moment Nelson had both feared and, on some level, always craved, the ultimate test. Chase, following Nelson's screamed commands, slammed the Ford into a side road, trying to lose the tail. But Cowley and Holohan were experts. They pursued relentlessly. What happened next was not a chase, but a rolling, point-blank gun battle at speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour, a level of automotive violence unprecedented in FBI history. Nelson didn't wait for an ambush, he initiated the fight. He leaned out the passenger window, clutching a .351 Winchester self-loading rifle, and opened fire on the agent's Chevrolet. The quiet afternoon was ripped apart by the staccato cracks of high-powered gunfire. Glass shattered. Metal screamed. Cowley, driving, returned fire with his pistol, an almost impossible task while controlling a speeding car. Holohan, in the passenger seat, wielded a shotgun and a Thompson submachine gun. The two vehicles swerved and jockeyed for position, tires screeching on the pavement, trading shots like dueling ships in a sea of asphalt. Witnesses described the surreal horror of it, the roar of engines, the deadly fireworks, the stark normalcy of the suburban backdrop. Nelson's Ford was hit repeatedly. A bullet tore into Chase's left arm. Another shattered the windshield, spraying glass. But Nelson, fueled by a superhuman rage, was a relentless gunner. One of his rifle rounds found its mark, striking Agent Holohan in the head. The veteran agent slumped, mortally wounded. The Chevrolet, now with a dying passenger and a wounded driver, began to falter. Cowley, shot through the hand and body, somehow managed to bring the car to a crashing, grinding halt in a ditch. The Ford, riddled with bullets and spewing radiator steam, careened another 100 yards before Nelson forced Chase to stop. The scene was one of apocalyptic stillness after the storm. And then, Nelson did the thing that sealed his legend in infamy. He didn't flee immediately. Clutching his rifle, he stumbled back toward the agent's wrecked car. Samuel Cowley, bleeding profusely, had crawled from the Chevrolet and drawn his service revolver. He saw Nelson coming. The two men, both dying in their own way, exchanged a final, silent look across the bloody distance. Cowley raised his pistol. Nelson raised his rifle. A final shot rang out. Cowley fell, struck in the heart. Nelson, satisfied, turned and walked back to the stolen Ford. He had won his last gunfight. He had killed 2 more FBI agents. But he had also taken his own death sentence. In that barrage of gunfire, Nelson himself had been hit multiple times. One bullet had sliced through his liver and kidney. Another had lodged near his spine. He was bleeding internally, a fatal wound that no amount of adrenaline could overcome. He collapsed into the passenger seat, a sudden, shocking weakness overtaking him. The invincible gangster was finally, mortally vulnerable. With Chase wounded and Nelson dying in the seat beside him, Helen Gillis now took command. She shoved Chase over, took the wheel of the bullet-ridden car, and drove away from the scene of the battle, not toward a hospital, but toward a desperate, hopeless sanctuary. The final act of babyface Nelson's brutal life would be written not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, desperate agony of a safe house bedroom, as his legendary rage finally seeped out of him, drop by drop, onto the clean sheets of an ordinary home, far from the chaotic streets where he had built his terrible name. Helen Gillis, her hands gripping the blood-slicked steering wheel of the dying Ford, faced an impossible calculus. Behind her, on the sun-dappled road of Barrington, lay 2 more federal agents added to her husband's grim tally. Beside her, John Paul Chase clutched his wounded arm, groaning in pain, and slumped against the passenger door, the furious engine of his life now sputtering and seizing, was Lester. The babyface was gone, replaced by a pale, shocky man breathing in shallow, wet hitches. The car itself was a rolling ruin, peppered with bullet holes, its radiator hissing a plume of steam like a final, exhausted sigh. They couldn't go to a hospital. It would be an instant arrest. They couldn't stop. Every passing car was now a potential police cruiser. So Helen drove on instinct, a deep, wifely instinct for sanctuary, pushing the battered vehicle north and west, away from the immediate dragnet she knew would soon descend. They needed to disappear, and she remembered a place. They headed for a safe house near the town of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, a prearranged refuge known only to the innermost circle. It was the home of a woman named Lillian Holcomb, the mother of a minor gang associate. The journey was a nightmare tableau. Nelson, drifting in and out of consciousness, was in excruciating pain. The initial adrenaline that had fueled his walk back to the car had evaporated, revealing the catastrophic damage beneath. Internal bleeding from a severed liver and kidney was filling his abdominal cavity. A bullet near his spine was causing paralysis and agony. He was, minute by minute, bleeding to death inside his own skin. Helen, her own nerves stretched to breaking, navigated backroads, avoiding main thoroughfares, while Chase attempted to stem the flow of blood with makeshift bandages. They finally reached the Holcomb house, a modest dwelling at what is now 550, Route 12, in Wilmot, Wisconsin, as evening fell. The sight that greeted Lillian Holcomb was one from a fever dream, the most wanted man in America, barely conscious, being half carried into her home, his clothes soaked in dark, crimson blood. There was no doctor, no morphine, no hope. They laid him on a bed in an upstairs bedroom, a shockingly ordinary room about to become the final chamber for a profoundly unordinary life. The myth of the untouchable supercriminal dissolved there, on those simple sheets. Nelson was lucid in fleeting moments, but the rage had been replaced by a terrifying vulnerability. He knew he was dying. The man who had faced down dozens of lawmen with a snarl now faced the infinite with the confused fear of a child. He asked for a priest. This request, perhaps more than any of his crimes, reveals the shattered human being behind the public enemy facade. The ultimate rebel, who had spent a lifetime defying every law of man and God, sought final absolution. Helen, ever resourceful, ever devoted, somehow contacted a local Catholic priest from a nearby parish, Father Joseph P. Murphy. What Father Murphy walked into was a scene of profound moral and physical wreckage. He administered the last rites to Lester Gillis in that quiet bedroom, the Latin prayers a soft counterpoint to the labored, bubbling breaths of the gangster. The ritual complete, Nelson reportedly whispered his final words, a statement that was neither a boast nor a confession of guilt, but a simple, exhausted declaration of identity. I'm done for. I'm all in. And then, he slipped into a final unconsciousness. The long, violent fever had broken. At around 7:30 p.m. on November 27, 1934, less than 5 hours after his last epic gun battle, Lester Joseph "Babyface" Nelson died in that borrowed bed. The silence that followed in the room was heavier than any gunshot. The immediate problem for those left in the house was monstrous. What to do with the body of the nation's most notorious criminal? The FBI and every police force in the Midwest would be scouring the landscape for him. Keeping him here was impossible. Burying him secretly risked discovery and desecration. In a macabre twist, the decision was made not to hide his death, but to use his corpse as a final tool of misdirection. Under cover of darkness, Helen, Chase, and the terrified Mrs. Holcomb wrapped Nelson's body in a blanket, carried it down the stairs, and placed it in the trunk of the bullet-riddled Ford. They then drove the car to a lonely spot on a side road near what is now the intersection of Illinois Route 173 and Milwaukee Avenue, just north of Chicago. They propped Nelson's body against a cold, stone wall near the entrance to the St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery in Niles Center, now Skokie. The symbolism was grim, deliberate, and achingly futile, leaving the sinner at the gates of the sacred. They then abandoned the car and scattered. The following morning, 2 telephone linemen on their way to work found the grisly scene. A small, neatly dressed man, looking almost asleep, slumped against a wall, surrounded by the shattered glass and metal scars of a terrible fight. The news, when it broke, sent a seismic wave through the nation. The FBI, after confirming the identity through fingerprints, declared victory. Hoover had his trophy. The press ran sensational headlines, but the photos told a different story. Not a fearsome gangster laid low in battle, but a slight, boyish-looking corpse, looking utterly defeated and alone. The autopsy would reveal the horrific extent of his injuries: 17 bullet holes in the Ford, and multiple, fatal gunshot wounds in Nelson. He had, quite literally, been shot to pieces. His body, unclaimed and unwanted by any family fearing retribution or spectacle, was eventually buried in a potter's field at the Cook County Cemetery in Poorhouse Ground. The location was kept secret, a final, anonymous obliteration for a man who craved infamy. In a bitter postscript, John Paul Chase was captured weeks later. Helen Gillis, after months on the run, was apprehended. Both were convicted of harboring and other charges. Helen served time, was released, and lived a long, quiet life under a new name, forever carrying the weight of those final hours in Wisconsin. Chase, convicted for his role in the murders of the agents, would spend decades in Alcatraz, a living relic of a bygone era of violence. The legend of Babyface Nelson, however, refused to be buried so easily. The death of Babyface Nelson marked more than just the demise of a single gangster. It signaled the definitive end of the romanticized, frontier-like era of the American bank robber. The spell was broken. The Great Depression's outlaw icons, Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde, and now Nelson, had all been violently erased within a matter of months in 1934, a systematic dismantling by a newly empowered and relentless Federal Bureau of Investigation. J. Edgar Hoover, savvy in public relations, used these victories to cement the mythos of the invincible G-Man, shifting the public's fascination from the charming bandit to the efficient, scientific crime fighter. The FBI's methods, often brutal and extra-legal in their pursuit of these men, were justified by the result. Nelson, in particular, served as the perfect villain for Hoover's narrative, a psychopath so irredeemable that any means of his eradication were deemed acceptable. His legacy, therefore, is dual-natured. In the official record, he is a cautionary footnote, the most violent of them all, used to illustrate the Bureau's necessity and prowess. But in the darker corners of American folklore, his name evokes a different question. What creates such a creature? Nelson was not a product of intricate master planning or political rebellion. He was a pure, malignant symptom of his time, a vortex of personal inadequacy, societal collapse, and the easy availability of terrible weaponry. His boyish face, forever frozen in a scowl in mugshots, belied a bottomless insecurity. His nickname was a lifetime emasculation, a taunt he tried to burn away with muzzle flash. Every robbery was an attempt to prove a stature he physically lacked. Every murder was an assertion of control in a world that had offered him none. The Depression provided the backdrop of desperation and disillusionment, but where others sought bread, Nelson sought dominion through fear. He was the ultimate antithesis of the Robin Hood archetype. He stole not from the rich to give to the poor, but from anyone in his path to feed his own fury. His violence was intimate, personal, and gleeful. This is what truly separates him and cements his infamy. While other gangsters viewed killing as a business necessity or a last resort, Nelson treated it as a primary hobby, the exhilarating point of the exercise. His rise was not a climb but an acceleration, a straight line plotted on a graph of escalating brutality. His downfall was not a tragic fall from grace, but the predictable, terminal collision of a human projectile with the immovable wall of state power. And in that final, mythic gun battle on the Barrington Road, he achieved a kind of twisted apotheosis. He died not in a sneaky ambush, but in the heroic, shootout format he worshipped, on his feet and taking his enemies with him. It was the death he would have written for himself. Yet, the tawdry, desperate reality of his final hours, the pleading for a priest, the anonymous dumping of his corpse, strips away any last vestige of glory. It leaves us with the stark, pathetic image of a small, broken man dying in a stranger's bed, his empire consisting of nothing but a warm pistol and a list of the dead. The aftermath for those he touched was a lingering ruin. The families of the men he killed, from the FBI agents to the innocent bystanders caught in his crossfire, carried their grief for generations. His own accomplices faced decades in prison, their lives consumed by his wake. And the nation, collectively, began to turn the page. The legal landscape changed because of him and his ilk. Banks implemented new security measures, the federal government expanded its jurisdiction over crime, and the romantic outlaw was permanently replaced in the public imagination by the cold, efficient agency of the state. Today, the specific locations of his violence are largely forgotten, paved over by suburbs and strip malls. The stone wall where his body was dumped is long gone. His unmarked grave in what is now the Cook County Home Cemetery is a numbered plot in a field of the forgotten, a deliberate anonymity that is the final insult to his desperate crave for notoriety. So, what are we to make of Babyface Nelson now? He is not a figure to be admired, nor one whose story should be told with a thrill. He is a case study in pathological rage, a reminder of the terrifying human capacity for violence when empathy is entirely absent. His story is a dark mirror held up to an era of profound dislocation, reflecting back not a charming rogue, but the snarling, frightened, and ultimately hollow face of pure, sociopathic ambition. In the end, the most shocking truth about Lester Gillis may be his sheer insignificance outside of the damage he caused. He built nothing, he created nothing, he left no legacy but scars. He was a scream in the dark, momentarily deafening, then swallowed forever by the silence. His enduring presence in the true crime pantheon serves as a grim benchmark, our answer to the question, how bad could it get? He is the measurement. He is the limit. And in understanding that, we perhaps gain a clearer, more sober understanding of the fragile lines between order and chaos, and the perpetual human cost when those lines are crossed by a man whose only language was the sound of a gun being fired, again and again and again, until there was nothing left to shoot. If you found this deep dive into a darker chapter of history compelling, then you're in the right place. Our channel is dedicated to unearthing these complete, nuanced stories, moving beyond the headlines to understand the people, the times, and the consequences. We put significant research into every script to ensure accuracy and depth. So, if you want to join us on more journeys like this one, please show your support. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Leave a like if you appreciated the detail, and tell us in the comments, who or what era should we explore next? Your engagement is what fuels this channel. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care.